Turn with me to Acts 17 if you're not already there. You're going to need to follow along as I skip around in this passage. And when I teach from the ESV, the English Standard Version, not because it's any better than the NIV, but because it is a version that is word for word and follows the Greek text as closely as possible. And the NIV, which you have in your pew Bibles, is a thought-for-thought translation and prefers to get the sense of the thing right rather than having each word. So that's why I do this, why I teach out of this particular version. All right, that being said, I want to put a thesis question before us and then see if we can work through it in short order. What is Christian proclamation? What is Christian proclamation, and why is this important to your life and mine? That's my question. And that's what I'd like us to try and answer as we go through this one example out of the experience of Paul and his traveling companions. And as we begin to see what they did, we may be able to see what the value of it is for us. So I also have a statement I want to make. Acts 17 traces the movement of the gospel from a Jewish context into a world context without losing the basic message of the gospel, without losing the integrity of the message of the gospel. Paul and his companions moved, and I'll show you how that happened, from a Jewish context into a world context without ever changing their essential message. So we have another map, I think, that we can put up, right? This will help us to know where we are. Great. All right, so this is what's called Paul's second missionary journey. Leave the word missionary out of it. It's just a trip, okay? Because missionary gives you pictures of, being greeted by tribes with spears, and we don't want those kind of pictures here. Because this was actually a very, very cultured, very educated area. So they started in Antioch down in what is now extreme southern Turkey, right on the Syrian border. They retraced the steps that they had made, or part of what their first trip had been, to go and visit churches that they had planted in Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. We looked at that last week. And then they moved on to what's called Pisidian Antioch. These are two different places. Pisidian Antioch is up in central Turkey. And finally to Troas, where they got on a boat, crossed over at the bidding of a vision that Paul had from a man of Macedonia, it says. And in this vision, he was told to go over and to preach the gospel at Philippi, and then to move down to Berea, finally to Athens. And what is happening here is that each place along the way, Paul preaches in the Jewish synagogue there. So understand, Judaism had made its way all across this area. Judaism was not restricted in the first century to Israel, which is, you see where Jerusalem is way down in the lower right-hand corner. I've never been able to do that, mirror images thing, in the lower right-hand corner. So Judaism is not restricted to Israel, but Judaism has made its way across the whole empire. And there are synagogues, teaching locations, places where the Jews received teaching and where they offered teaching to proselytes, to people who were interested in the faith, to those who were becoming converted into Judaism. Conversion is not something unique to Christianity. And so people would go into these synagogues across the empire to hear good teaching of all kinds. And largely, the synagogues up through this area were open to listen to pretty much anybody. It didn't have to be somebody who had a strictly Jewish message. Although I'm sure you'd get first dibs on preaching if you had the credentials that somebody like Paul did. Remember, Paul was a citizen of Rome. He was also a citizen of Israel. And he was a very pedigreed citizen of Israel, having trained under some of the great rabbis of his day. And so as a Pharisee, as a rabbi himself, he was welcomed in all of these synagogues. Now, he proclaims in the synagogue, principally. This is where Paul starts to bring his message. It's not like they're just walking down Main Street, in Derby going, anybody want to hear that Jesus is Lord? Anyone want to hear? Kind of like the town crier. That's not what happened. What happened was they went into the synagogue and they spoke in an organized teaching location. It's kind of the same in a non-religious way. If someone were to set up at Harvard or at Yale, someplace where they could really attract a very cultured, very educated audience. And that's what Paul did. And so as we begin to trace his travel, we saw Philippi last week. Paul goes first to Thessalonica. Now, Thessalonica is a port city. It's a very important city in Greece and in what's this whole region of Greece where you see Philippi, Berea, and Thessalonica up there. That's all what was called Macedonia in that day, right? So they go first to Thessalonica, and it says that on I'm in verse 2b, by the way, and halfway through verse 2 of chapter 17. On 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. This is a very Jewish message. And it's a Jewish message delivered in the synagogue at Thessalonica. So what Paul is doing is something that Jewish ears hear and understand. Now we've translated it transliterated from the Greek, and they understand that Acts was written to us in Greek originally, or at least the oldest copies we've got are in Greek. So we will assume for a second that if he's speaking in a synagogue, he's not speaking in Greek, or if he is, he's using the word Messiah, not the word Christos or Christ, which is the Greek word. Messiah is Hebrew, Christos or Christ is Greek. It's the same exact meaning. And so on 3 separate Sabbath days, in other words, for 3 weeks at least, possibly when you have 3 Sabbath days, if you add the weeks on either end, you've got a whole month, right? 4 weeks. And so for about a month, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. From what Scriptures? From the Old Testament. He reasoned with the Jewish believers in the synagogue at Thessalonica from the Old Testament, explaining and proving, because it is easy to prove using the prophecies of the Old Testament, that Jesus was the Christ. And then to prove that the Christ had to suffer and to rise from the dead. That's also easy to support from the Old Testament. Now I'm going to pause there and move you on to his next location. In verse 11, he's down in Berea. When he was in Berea, he does the exact same thing. He goes into the synagogue and he speaks again. And there it says that he and the Jews who were in Berea at the synagogue were examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Well, to see what things were so. Well, Luke was economizing on paper, and so we now know that the content was exactly what it was in Thessalonica, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. So as these educated Jews come together in the synagogue, they sit down and day after day, they spend time examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things are so. Notice that the synagogue is not primarily a place of worship, it's primarily a place of teaching. And so this would be much more like what we do here with our bag lunch Bible study on Wednesday. You should all be coming to Wednesday morning at 11:30 to our bag lunch Bible study. That was a shameless ad because it's a place for teaching, okay? It's an opportunity to be taught the Scriptures and to examine these things to see if they are so. Move forward again, and it's interesting to me that he doesn't stay up in Macedonia. He goes right to Greece. he's moving out of a Jewish context, really. And he's moving to the heart of it. This is like if you were doing this kind of teaching today. You've moved from out in the sticks. You moved from Harvard, to the very cultured area where Yale is. Gives you some idea of how I feel about these two universities. And then to move down to New York City and have your conversation in New York with governmental leaders who have gathered together. That's what this was like. He went down to Athens. This is the center of Greek culture. Not just to Athens, but we're going to find out. Once he gets there, there's a bit of a fracas that happens, and they get a hold of him. And instead of taking him out to stone him like they'd done back in Lystra, instead of stoning Paul, they want to find out what this new teaching is. And so they don't take him to the seat of government, they take him to the seat of law. They take him to one of the great court spaces of Athens, a place called the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus is an interesting place. I wish I had a picture to show you. It's just today, it's just a big old rock outcropping on the way up what we call Mars Hill. Now, the hill of Areos is a minor, not a mountain, but it's like a small hill. It goes up about 450 feet, towering over the city of Athens. We call it Mars Hill because that's the Roman designation. Mars and Ares are these two names for the same god. And so Paul is climbing Mars Hill. He walks up Mars Hill, followed by the court called the Areopagus, the men of the court, who are these cultured, wise, older men who are going to now hear what Paul has to say. Some of them were what were called Epicureans. And these are people who fancy themselves as real scholars, okay? And this court had some ability in Athens to judge disputes about religion. And so that's why he was taken to the Areopagus. Not only does he go to this place, which is halfway up, as I said, halfway up Mars Hill, but we have to acknowledge at the beginning of this little tale, what's at the top of Mars Hill? Does anyone know, just off the top of your head, anyone who's ever traveled in Greece perhaps, what's at the top of Mars Hill? The Acropolis, which is the greatest concentration of idols in the entirety of Greece. The Acropolis is at the top of Mars Hill. Now that figures into the story a little bit here as we tell it. So when he gets to the Areopagus, Paul is now asked, so what's all this about? He's told us back at, I don't have the verse number here, but he told us earlier when he was in Thessalonica, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. And that's a distinctly world way of saying it. It's not. It isn't really a Hebrew way of saying this. This Jesus, he uses the Greek word Jesus, is the Christ, not Messiah, the Christ. Now I'm thinking that they translated this intentionally here, because he's moving into a Greek context. He's appealing to Greek thinking. This Jesus, the human person, this particular individual, is the Jewish Messiah, the Christ. And it is this Jesus whom I proclaim to you. And it's a Greek word from which, I'm not going to try and teach you the Greek word, but it's the Greek word from which we get the word evangelical. To be an evangelical is to proclaim. To call yourself an evangelical Christian is to proclaim something. And the very basis of our faith is proclamation. And it's important that we understand that this is what Paul does when he gets to the Areopagus, because proclamation is at the core of our belief. It isn't something that we call it in our doctrine. It doesn't say we are proclaimers, but it certainly is at the very core of our being as Christians. Listen to some of these passages I'm going to share with you. Now, unless you're extremely good at flipping your Bible pages, or unless you have flying fingers like Jeff does on his iPad, and can get to the texts really quick. Don't bother changing pages. Just listen. 1 Corinthians 1:17. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach. Christ didn't send me to baptize. He sent me to preach. 1 Corinthians 1:21. For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Say amen. 1 Corinthians 1:23. But we preach Christ crucified. There's Paul being really clear about it. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. 1 Corinthians 9:16. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Paul really saw it as something was an absolute imperative. Woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. 1 Corinthians 15:11. Whether it was I or they, so we preached, and so you believed. There can be no belief without preaching. Galatians chapter 1, verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we proclaimed to you, let him be accursed. There's only one gospel according to Paul. There's only one message, and there's only one proclamation. Ephesians 3:8. To me, though I'm the very least of all the saints, this is Paul talking about himself, this grace was given to proclaim to the Gentiles, to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. That's our core. It is absolutely at the foundation of us that we proclaim Christ. Philippians 1:15, one of my favorites. Some indeed, he says, preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here in prison for the defense of the gospel. See, some people will actually proclaim Christ thinking that they're going to get your attention and be able to get more converts into their church. And yet, it's still the proclamation of the gospel. So no matter whether it is done for pretense or for truth, Paul just glories that Christ is proclaimed. He rejoices in that. 1 Timothy 3:16. Here's an early creedal form for us. Great, indeed, we confess is the mystery of godliness. He puts this right into the creed. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed or preached among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up into glory. That's a creed about Jesus, an early statement of what we believe. And preaching is right in there. Finally, as he speaks to Timothy at the end of his ministry around 65 AD, just before they lopped his head off, he says, preach the word. That's his final instruction to one of his disciples. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. What's the response that comes from people who preach the gospel, who proclaim the gospel this forcefully? What happens when you do this? Well, you're going to find that it's going to stir things up. The men who followed them from Thessalonica to Berea stirred up a controversy at Berea where the gospel was being received with great joy. They get there and they're really mad because Paul had come and preached at Thessalonica, and they said, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And then they start whining about the guy who took them in. And Jason has received them, and they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar. Doesn't this sound whiny to you? Saying there's another king named Jesus. That wasn't at all what Paul's content of the gospel was. He never said that Jesus was the temporal king. He said that Jesus was the king of all creation. All right. So Paul intentionally moves the gospel out of a primarily Jewish context into a primarily Greek context, ending this trip out at Athens. The trajectory of Paul's second journey is toward the Greek world. His method is to preach in the synagogues and then in the streets. At Philippi, for instance, where there was no synagogue, it was a place of prayer, a place where Jews went to pray and to worship. And since there was no synagogue, that's where he went, and then out from there into the streets. All right, now we're in the Areopagus. Don't worry about it. It's okay. We take all comers. Now we're in the Areopagus, and Paul is going to proclaim Christ in this very intense, very astute, culturally Greek place. He's completely outside of his Jewish context. Listen to what happens. Standing in the midst, I'm going to read and I'm going to make some comments as I go. Standing in the midst of the Areopagus, which is, Paul has been brought to court. He said, "Men of Athens." Paul's speaking to cultural context. He's not speaking to authority. He's not treating them as the esteemed judges. That's what he would have said, because the Greek way was to bow several times essentially and call somebody by title. He's got the Areopagus around him. He's got the court around him. My esteemed judges, my deeply revered judges. That's the way they would have said it. That's not what he says. He says, "Men of Athens." He's treating them as human beings. He's not treating them as an institution. He's treating them as individuals. Men of Athens. He's speaking to context, not to authority. "I perceive that in every way you are very religious." He approves what he can. And this is something we really have to think about. So often in the 20th century and 21st century, evangelical Christians have thrown the baby out with the bathwater when we start to talk into a cultural context. We walk into a place and we say, "This is all wrong, you need the gospel." That's not what Paul does here. Paul walks into the cultural context. He says, "I perceive that in every way you are religious. You're very religious. I can approve that. I think it's wonderful that you are interested in spiritual things. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship." Remember, he started off in downtown Athens, and this crowd and the men of the Areopagus take him up to halfway up Mars Hill in order to examine the things he's saying. They haven't arrested him. This is the place where they're going to hear his story. But on the way from downtown Athens up to the Areopagus, guess what he passed? He passed a lot of statues. He passed a lot of the kind of Greek idols that were there to, kind of reinforce the pantheon. "For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, the setting on the way up the hill, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" There's the opportunity. There's the entry point. I don't have to talk about Zeus. I don't have to talk about Hermes. I don't have to talk about the various gods that I saw along the way. There's one of these statues that says, "To an unknown God." There's my opportunity. As you speak to culture, as you are walking out in culture, Don't shut it out. Don't shut it off. Listen to culture. Listen to the art. Listen to the music. Listen to the things that are on the radio. Listen to the things that people are saying. And I don't mean conservative talk radio. I mean listen to the things that are on pop radio. Even if that's not what you like to listen to it. Listen to culture, or you'll never, never, never understand what people are feeding themselves. Go into McDonald's. Don't eat it. Just go in there. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. You don't know what this is. I know what it is, and I'm going to tell you what it is. Those opportunities are all around you every day in pop culture. When you're standing there and somebody is at the cash register, and sitting on the desk there is one of those things where you can put a few coins in. This happens at McDonald's. Put a few coins in to help some needy cause, right? And there's an opportunity for the gospel. You can engage them about that and say, what is this? What's the cause here? Oh, well, we help people. Really? Why do you help people? What's your motivation? Well, I just want to be a good person. Really? That's great. I know what can make you someone who is a God-honoring person. See, you've had an opening for the gospel and you didn't even know it. Reading on. Paul now is going to proclaim to you that God can be known. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. I love this moment. It's a visual moment. He's standing halfway up Mars Hill. Do you know what you can see from this rock outcropping on Mars Hill? You can look down the path at all the statues that litter the street. You can look up the path. And I have no question that Paul, because it's open air preaching, I have no question Paul raised his hand when he said this, because right behind him, right in the field of vision, is the Acropolis. And all he had to do was say, the God who made the world and everything in it. He's debunking mythology without ever saying, you're wrong. He never has to say that. The God who made the earth and everything in it does not live in temples made with hands. There it is, up there on the hill, the Acropolis. He never had to say, you're wrong. He just had to say what the truth was. Nor is God served by human hands as though he needed anything. It's a direct challenge to the priests of the gods, and yet he never says, your priests are all washed up, they're all wrong. He never does that. Since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. It's not a pantheon of gods. I want you to understand this God that you have a statue to, the one that's unknown. This God can be known. And you know what? He created absolutely everything. And they can read between the lines because they're smart people. And he made from one man, Adam, he made from one man every nation of mankind rather, to live on the face of all the earth. Adam, not the gods, is the father of the race. Having determined allotted periods and boundaries for their dwelling place, that's it, every epoch and every nation is determined by God. There is Paul proclaiming without ever having to say you're wrong. What's his purpose? It's even in his proclamation that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. What a great thing. What a great possibility that when you go into McDonald's, when you go to the library, when you go to the laundromat, where I don't know where you go, all the different places where you go. When Paula, when you go to work at the school system, okay, you have an opportunity there without ever saying you're wrong or you're off or you've mistaken about something. You can look at culture, you can find the things that offer that moment of proclamation. And the reason that you would want to do it is so that people could begin to find their way to God. Your proclamation doesn't have to be the absolute, compendium thing. I'm going to give you my 5 Bible verses, and we're going to sit down for the next hour, and we're going to go over these 5 Bible verses until you know the gospel. No, that's not what Paul does. Look what he does. He says that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. And then he brings in 2 of these cultural examples. First is a quote, "In him we live and move and have our being." It's a text from Epimenides, a 7th century Greek. And then he quotes a poet from the 300s BC, a poet named Aratus, I can't even pronounce his name. And in one of his poems, he says, "For we indeed are his offspring." He finds truth. You ever go through pop music and try and find a nugget of truth? It's there. So often, the things that they're singing about have the truth of God in them. All you have to do is draw it out and share it. Being then God's offspring, Paul says, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone. Okay, now he's beginning to get serious with them about idolatry. God overlooked times of ignorance. He's drawing his message to a conclusion. Because he fixed a day on which he will judge the world through one man, Jesus. Now he gets down to the simplest, most basic proclamation of the gospel he could. Here it is. "And of this he has given assurance to all by raising Christ from the dead," by raising him from the dead. There's the simplest proclamation. Did you know that Jesus was raised from the dead? That's all you have to say to somebody sometimes. Did you know that I really believe that Jesus was raised from the dead? You're not challenging absolutely everything they think. You're just offering something. You're saying a piece of what is the truth. I'm relating this to your life. Do you know that Jesus was raised from the dead? Does that mean anything to you? Our proclamation needs to always leave people closer to Christ than when we found them. Preach Christ in such a way that people will want to hear you further on this subject. That's what Paul did. Because remember what the very end of the chapter 17 is? I love the way that they say this. It says, "Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, 'We'll hear you again about this. We'll hear you again about this.'" When you see that opportunity there at McDonald's or at your place of work or wherever it is, and you use that opportunity, make sure that you're not burning a bridge. Make sure you're building one. And make sure that the next thing you say leaves you the opportunity to say the thing after that. You know that Jesus was raised from the dead? And someone will go, "Huh, really? Yeah." Just leave it. Let it hang. That's what he did. He let it hang there. And then, the next time you get with that same person, by the way, relationship is the best way to do this. I don't recommend trying to do this by repeatedly going to the counter at McDonald's. Your friend will say, "We'll hear you more about this." And the next time you'll have another opportunity. All right. That is why I believe that proclamation is at the very core of what we have learned as Christians. And I believe that proclamation of the gospel is absolutely central to who we are as Christians and needs to be. So if you have not yet learned how to sensitively proclaim Christ to another, and how to do it in such a way that they will then ask you for another opportunity to hear, then I implore you, get with somebody. It doesn't have to be me. I'm certainly not the only voice in this room who could do this. Get with somebody who can teach you how. And if you're not a very sensitive person, then get with somebody who can teach you how to be a sensitive person. But in any case, learn how to proclaim Christ so that the next time the person comes to get together with you, they'll want to hear more. All right.